All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So welcome people. We're just gradually letting people in from the waiting room. Just bear with us a short while people come through, and then we'll be getting going. So just 30 seconds or so just to make sure we get everyone in from the waiting room. Lots of clicking buttons to make sure that we've got you all through in time. So we'll then be getting going. So fantastic. Good afternoon. Welcome to this session as part of the London Funders Festival of Learning. I'm James from the London Funders team. It's really fantastic to have so many of you here in the room with us. As many of you know, through the festival, we're trying to bring members together to look at reflections, learnings, insights from the last year that can help serve as a springboard for some of the discussion and action that we want to see in the funding community as we head towards recovery and renewal. So looking at some of the good things we've done, trying to amplify that, and also build that positive movement for progress and change in the sector. Really great that we've got colleagues from Ubele with us today, looking at structural racism in the sector and recommendations for funders as part of the Busca papers that hopefully many of you will have seen and read already. And we're hopeful that we're going to be able to bring members together to look at some of those issues. It's our most popular session of the day today, and it's fantastic to have Yvonne and Natalie with us. On a practical level, you'll see that this is a webinar format session, so you can only see the three of us on screen. We can't sadly see all of you. There are just too many of you to fit on the screen. But you can chat to each other in the chat box at the bottom of the screen if you have resources to share or particular insights that you want to contribute to other colleagues. And you can also ask questions of us, so Natalie, Yvonne and myself, through the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of the screen. If you keep an eye on that as well, you might see questions that other people have asked that you'd like to make sure are asked, and there's a thumbs up button you can tick that just votes those questions up to the top. There are a lot of you, and there's a lot more people who are interested in this as a topic, so we'd also encourage you to share what you're hearing through social media. If you're on Twitter, following us at London Funders and using the London Learn Fest hashtag, and then we'll also be producing a report of all these sessions as well to share more widely with the community of funders in membership. So that's the format for today, and I'll start by just telling you who we've got on screen with me for this session. So we've got Yvonne Field, who's the founder and chief executive of the Ubele Initiative, which is an African diaspora-led social enterprise that helps to build more sustainable communities across the UK. Ubele supports Black, Asian, minority ethnic community wealth building through sustainable community spaces, intergenerational leadership, community enterprise and social action. It's also, as many of you know, been the formal BAME infrastructure organisation for London and has been at the forefront working with us and others on the community response to COVID-19, recognising that disproportionate impact on Black and minoritised communities. Yvonne has a fantastic track record in the sector, more than 4 decades of working with individuals and groups across the UK, the English-speaking Caribbean, Asia, South Africa and mainland Europe. Her work with women, young people and Black and marginalised communities has created a lifelong commitment to the promotion of social justice, equalities and anti-discriminatory practice, from her academic roles to her community development achievements. It wouldn't be fair of me if I didn't say that on top of her leadership, Yvonne's also a sacred and valued member of a community that has relentlessly advocated for funding and participatory involvement of Black and minoritised communities to have a seat at the table when decisions are made and funds are allocated. Through all of this, she's been instrumental in work with us over the last year through the London Community Response, but also in creating what's been called the Phoenix Way with the National Lottery Community Fund. So Yvonne, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the panel with us today. We're also privileged to have Natalie join us as well, who's the programme manager at the Ubele Initiative and joined the team at possibly the craziest of times in the middle of the global pandemic. But she brings with her over 10 years experience of working with communities and young people, including people with disabilities, communities facing racial oppression, women and girls, the LGBTQI+ community. And she's also worked in South Africa, Ethiopia, India, Jamaica, and in refugee camps in Greece. She's a seasoned professional in the world of youth work and advocacy, and she's worked for organisations such as Stonewall UK, the Malala Fund, International Rescue Committee, the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and also has experience working for global foundations. She's on the board of youth activist organisation, the Advocacy Academy as well, and has completed postgraduate research on the concept of racial justice post-conflict and how to implement learnings from post-colonial societies to a UK context. She's worked in collaboration with UK Black Pride, the MP Dawn Butler, and a collection of activists mobilising to work on getting the true history of the British Empire on the national curriculum via the Runnymede Trust. And she was the main researcher and writer of the Busca papers that we'll be talking about today. So Natalie, it's also absolutely wonderful to have you join us as well. We've had the real privilege of working with Yvonne and Natalie and the Ubele team over the last year, And one of the big privileges of that has been the mutual sharing. So celebrating and honouring what we each bring to the conversation, and how that more trusting and equal partnership really leads to powerful change, personally, professionally, organisationally, across the funding community. So with that in mind, before we dive straight into me quizzing Yvonne and Natalie about structural racism, the Busca papers and the calls to action for funders, in chatting to Natalie last night, we were thinking about some questions that they had of me and of London funders. So to help balance out and set a bit of the context for discussion, I think there's a few questions you were going to ask me first, Natalie.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm realizing how long that introduction was now. Now you've said it. I only realized on paper it wasn't. Yeah. So we wanted to ask you, James, actually, because I had the pleasure of interviewing you for the Busca papers. So we aren't strangers, and I know that you've been working with Yvonne up until now. So there was just a couple of questions we wanted to ask, and the first one is why you felt this was an important conversation to have and invite us on.
Yeah, thank you. But I think it is a really important conversation. I think we can see that by the number of people who've signed up for the webinar today as part of the festival. And I think we've seen over the last year a big increase in awareness of racism through the pandemic, through the murder of George Floyd, the important contribution of the Black Lives Matter movement. And we've seen real commitments from funders to respond, building on some work that was happening before the last year. So thinking about equity and anti-racist practice, but I think it's really accelerated that understanding over the last year. And we've seen through that some really big shifts in the ways of thinking and working. I mean, the things we've done on the London Community Response referenced in the Busca papers, in terms of priority being given to funding Black and minoritized groups, and investment in infrastructure organisations like Ubele to be able to work with us on that. But they have been in many cases fairly short-term funding programmes responding to that more emergency situation. And we know from some of the work we've done with funders looking at what happens in the future through the After the Storm report we produced in December, that this is the moment when a lot of people are thinking about reviewing their strategies, thinking for the future, looking at what needs to change. And we think that the Busca paper is a powerful and really clear articulation of how funders can work to address racism. And we're hoping that today's session enables some of those calls to action to be woven through the learning that we can all take from the year, and that form part of our plans for the future. So that's why we wanted to have it today.
Thank you. Also, just to draw on an event that we both did recently together, which was Funding So White. It was hosted by Martha at Funding So White, and it was a great success. It was something, I haven't done anything like that before. And there was about 4 different funders who were white. And then I spoke a little bit about the Busca papers, but how was that experience for you, speaking about whiteness in the sector, rather than focusing on Black and minoritized communities? How was it speaking about whiteness itself?
Yeah, I think for me, that was actually the first time we'd actually talked about it as the flip side of the issue, as you say. I think on a personal and a professional level, I think of myself as an anti-racist, but the event got me really thinking about what it means to talk about white privilege, white supremacy, whiteness within the context of striving for a more equitable and just world that we want to see. And we know from discussions and from that panel that the funding community's got a long way to go to ensure that people are represented in where decisions are made. And we know that the power that we have shapes the process, shapes the culture of our organisations, of the networks that we work with. We know we can end up with systems that aren't designed for anybody who isn't white. Ambition is framed by hearing the voices of people who are only white, and that some of the other systems around us don't challenge us because they're also affected by whiteness too. So I think for me, that was a really powerful event in terms of thinking through the importance of making sure we create spaces to talk about whiteness alongside discussions about racism, if we're really actually going to tackle the problems and achieve some of the changes that we want to see. So it was a fantastic event to be a part of. And if you have, those of you watching, if you have missed it, I think the recording's available through the Charity So White YouTube channel on the website there.
It was a good discussion. Thank you for that, and thank you for also being honest about it, because we know that it's not difficult. It's difficult to talk about whiteness sometimes, but that is also what we are here to talk about. And just in general, how did you feel taking part in the Busca papers? Like as a funder, how did it feel to be interviewed, and how did you find the experience?
It felt like a really positive experience, actually, because I think in the middle of what could have felt like quite a crisis time, and we need to just be dedicating energy to just keeping things going, keeping the show on the road, for you to create some of the spaces to be quite thoughtful about the long term, despite being worn down by some of the challenges, the distress over the last year, creating some open and trusting spaces where we can have conversations about what the longer term ambitions should be, felt really positive. And I think it also felt really timely. I think, as we said at the beginning, that the link into how funders are reviewing their strategies, the opportunity to think about where long-term change can be brought about, being part of that conversation that can produce a report that can also lead to calls to action that can be turned into action, not just calls to action. So again, timely from that point of view as well. So thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you for being a part of it. Thank you.
It's a privilege. This is a general loving, Natalie, isn't
it? It was great. It was also really good to talk to you. I think yeah, we can get into it later, but I'll leave it for you now to maybe speak to Yvonne a little bit.
Fantastic. Thanks, Natalie. And thanks also for the importance of starting that session with some framing, because I think it isn't just about us asking you all the time. It's also about how we have a conversation as equals and be open to listening and learning from each other. So thank you for the prompt and the reminder. I'm going to start, Yvonne, by asking you a few questions, if I can, just in terms of that contextualising the recommendations of the Boosker papers. And obviously, we've worked really closely together over the last year in particular, but it'd be good to hear from you about how the last year has been for you.
Yeah, well, thank you, James, for inviting us to do this workshop. And the past year has been very full of activity and extremely challenging. And it's been challenging on, well, on a personal level as well, professional level. Personally, many of my family members have had COVID. I've had COVID, my daughter had it last March. So we've kind of had to manage, you know, supporting each other from a distance in order to get through that. And obviously personally as well. And it's linked to professional, but many of our members, as we've grown the team, have also been impacted directly by COVID from their family members and themselves. So we've had all of that kind of going on as a sort of backdrop to trying to step forward and support the community. Communities across, in fact, not just across London, as you know, although we are the regional organisation, but actually nationally. And that came about because, you know, as I've been saying over the past year, that I wasn't even aware of the extent and nature of the gap in support for Black and minoritized community organisations. I mean, I had some awareness prior to COVID, but we were only appointed back in February last year, so just a month before COVID hit, by the GLA, and had to step into this space and then could begin to really see, partly through the research we did, but also through emergency conversations with colleagues, you know, actually what was going on, the extent of the gap, the extent of the underinvestment, and the extent of the need that was unfolding rapidly. You know, alongside my colleagues, and it's not just us in Ubele, it's colleagues in the wider field and wider system, you know, we've been working flat out. And it feels like at times the more we work, the more that's needed, the more we unearth, the more that unfolds. So it has been a challenge. And I think a lot of people, as some of the researchers said, you know, I've got burnout. I know I'm taking a few days off later this month. I've not had a week off since 2019. And it's not a week that I'm having off, but I'm looking forward just a few days of not having to jump on email and be on a Zoom call or, you know, or respond rapidly to things. It's also, you know, conversing. I mean, there is a, I don't know if it's a shadow side, but there's another side to this story, which has been obviously one of, which has left me personally very humbled and feeling very privileged to having been able to serve our community. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, but my eye is actually burning for some reason. I'm not crying, but it is getting more and more sort of, and I don't actually have a tissue right next to me, but I'll manage. Yeah, it's been one where we've actually been able to really serve the community and to do some really exciting work, meet some extraordinary people from around the country, extraordinary, and to hear about, you know, work that we just never heard about before, that has been there for many years, has been there in spite of the funding, and will continue to be there. And the creativity, innovation, commitment, all of those things. I mean, I'm just blown away. So it's been a year of many sides, but we're still here today to tell the story and hopefully to help create the story in the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Yvonne. And I'm glad you are going to be getting a break
Yes.
coming up. I know we were talking back just before lockdown 2, I think we were both hoping to just have a break, and then everything got cancelled for both
exactly.
of us. So, hopefully that won't be too long to come. But you mentioned there about obviously being in touch with organisations who are doing a lot of work over a long period of time. This isn't just stuff that's happened over the last year through COVID, and you've been working with those communities. And we need to not forget that work was happening before the pandemic, before the murder of George Floyd. And are there things that you think you were working on before 2020 that we need to sort of hold on to for the future as well?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we were working on, we set ourselves up intentionally as an intergenerational organisation. So we're working on leadership and leadership development, community assets, community wealth, and also we're working internationally. Those were some of the things that we were doing. I think that, gosh.
Okay, Yvonne, do you want me to pause and have a chat with Natalie and come back to you?
Yeah, I think so. That would be really great. I need to go and get a tissue. I will be right back. Okay.
No, please do, Yvonne. We
Okay.
want to take care of you. You've been a key part of our response over the last year, so we can't have you. We need to support you as well, is the short version of that. Natalie, do you mind if I come to you then to look at the Booster papers in particular, and obviously the work you've been doing on that? And a reminder to everyone, we've got the Q&A box at the bottom, so as well as the conversation we're having right now, we'll also be coming some questions from you in a few minutes. So do put your questions in the Q&A box and use that thumbs up button to come back to us on anything you'd like to make sure are prioritised in the conversation. But Natalie, before we do that, if I can come to you for a few questions, and you asked me at the beginning about how it was taking part in the Booster papers work. Could I ask you the question from the other side? How was it for you collating all the evidence and actually writing the papers?
I'm thinking about the reality of what happens when you start to speak about it is that it can invoke a really strong emotional response, much like Yvonne. I just want to echo everything Yvonne said. Like there was it's a lot, but also there's like this quite distinct humility in being able to serve the communities that are serving people. Burnout was a theme throughout. I mean, I started collecting the research in December until the report was launched in April. And over that time period, we experienced peaks in the UK with the new strain, an introduction of a vaccine, and a lot of political unrest, and people were really, really tired. So I would have meetings with funders, and I have to disclaim, like, everybody wanted to check it was anonymous. As soon as you bring up the topic of race or racism or structural racism, everybody wants to check and cross-check that they are not going to be quoted on, and their organization is going to read about it and they said the wrong thing. And I think that kind of speaks to the fragility that we're in, as well as how there is so much silence on speaking about race and having that open dialogue. What I came into was off the back of a report that Ubele already had published, which was that 9 out of 10 BAME-led organisations were about to close or looked like they might be facing closure. And that became, what we realised is that was a real shock for people. For Black and minoritized communities, that's not really, it's shocking. Of course it's shocking, but it's also not unexpected in a way. And I think what I found was, like, between interviewing the funders and interviewing the organization, there was a very different perception of expectations and reality. And it was great, to be honest, to hear a lot of funders say that they are committed to anti-racism and they want to do better and they need to do better, and kind of disclose a lot of areas where they are falling short. And it was refreshing to receive that honesty, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the trauma, actually, as well, that the Black and minoritized communities were going through, including taking care of people in a way that should be governed by the state. Like, if we think that we have human rights in the UK, some of the testimonies that I heard from people trying to manage infrastructure organisations and grassroots organisations suggested otherwise, that people were not accessing basic needs like food, water, heating, and a safe place to live. Those things were really falling short during COVID, and it was actually people of colour and Black people that stepped in for their own community. And a lot of that work has still largely been unrecognised and unpaid. And I think that that is something that really came through when I was interviewing people and writing the report. A lot of people had the similar sort of feedback from the Black minorities community. It was the similar feedback, and I have to say it wasn't new. But in terms of funders, it was the first time that I'd kind of like realized that people were aware of the disproportionate impact and that they had intentions to do something about it. I could go into all the different things that I heard, but I don't want to sort of like glorify like the deep trauma that people have been through. But it's not, so many of these stories are still unheard. We've put the paper together and we've given a few testimonies that we collected, but it is nothing in comparison to what people have actually been going through in this time. And I just want to make that point.
Thanks, Natalie. And actually, that's a really important point. I think maybe, Yvonne, if I could bring you back in as well, because I think as Natalie says that, and as you've said, the last year's seen real loss, distress and trauma for many people in Black and minoritized communities, and those disproportionate impacts have been more visible, but they're building on legacies of trauma for many years. Is there anything you'd want to sort of share about the effects of the last year, in particular on Black and minoritized communities? I just need you to unmute again, Yvonne, now you're back with us.
Thank you. So, yeah, well, I think, you know, what's been said time and time again over the last year is that COVID illuminated, shed light on, brought to the fore what we already knew in Black and minoritized communities. And it felt that nobody was really listening to us, you know, even though the evidence was also there through the data that's been collected in health and education and social care and employment. But actually it felt that that data kind of sat somewhere else. It didn't actually touch the lives of real people. And I think that what COVID has done is it's actually really shed light on the realities for real people in this country. We're not talking about the global majority. We're talking about we're talking about the global north, and an industrialized country that has huge wealth, like, you know, and where people came from other parts of this country because we were asked to come here and to help build that wealth. It feels like now kind of, you know, this is out there and it can't quite go back into the same place that it came from, because actually reality's changed, sense of reality. People kind of now can see it quite starkly. You know, because we started grassroots, we started in communities, and we're still rooted in communities because we help incubate new ideas. We have 2 centres that we're working with, one that we're co-stewards of in Wolves Lane, which during the pandemic, you know, we've been involved in grassroots initiatives around supporting the food system, because Wolves Lane is a food growing space. It's 3.5 acres. So we, you know, my colleagues have been supplying over 300 meals a week to people who are food insecure, hot meals, and growing food and getting them out through, you know, and also working with waste food, because we waste so much. So for us, this past year has really, you know, I mean, we talk about recovery, you know, we're beginning to talk about recovery, but people are still, you know, in the, I mean, last April, I wrote an article, which was about, I use a Titanic, and it was, you know, I'm not waving, I'm drowning. That was the article that I wrote at the beginning, and people are still drowning, right? So, you know, we're not all in the lifeboats yet. People have drowned, there's no doubt about that, but we're not all going to get in the lifeboats, and we're definitely not all in there yet. So I think we need still to think about what's the emergency and pandemic we're still in, you know, and that because people, you know, even if people have, we know we've got the vaccine, but those people who got COVID, some of them have got long COVID and all the impact of that, and that families have been devastated. People who lost people, families have been devastated. You know, we did a very small piece of work with Patrick Vernon for the Majonzi Fund, and that is just beginning to give some small grants to help people, one, receive counselling and trauma support, but also for memoria, to remember those that have actually been lost. And we know when people pass away, there's incredible trauma within families. Families fall apart, let alone passing away under such conditions. So I think that, you know, this past year has churned up so much that we still are coming to terms with, and the impact will be there. I think it will be intergenerational. I think it will be intergenerational, regardless of what the recovery looks like. It's almost like, right, we have the trauma, now we're into recovery. No, we're talking about people's lives.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ivana. Really, really important points, that these things do not go in nice, neat, clear phases. You know, you have a crisis, then you have a recovery, and then everything's fine. This is actually about long-term issues that can escalate and ebb and flow as we go. And I guess one of the if I can ask you one more question, Yvonne, which is, I think the boost papers obviously talk about some of the long-term ambitions for the sector. You're also talking there about some of the short-term needs, immediate needs, sorry, of the sector as well. If you had some sort of messages for funders about what you would like them to do now, as well as for the long term, what sort of things would you be saying to us and our members?
I think, you know, there has been a real important narrative that's been created over the past year from the sector, about our sector, from the sector. The Buska papers is an attempt to put our views, our voice in the middle. There have been papers that have been not from our sector, but shows what the needs are of the sector, that's led and responded to the needs of Black and minoritized communities in this country. So now we have the evidence, right? We didn't have much evidence before, or maybe we did, but it wasn't brought to the fore in the way that it has in the last 15 months. So for me, now's the time to act. Yeah, as you said at the beginning, James, you know, this is the paper landed quite in a timely fashion. We thought it was going to be late, but actually, as the months unfolded, we thought, actually, it seems that it's kind of on time. You know, you can't hurry up these things. Sometimes they come when they're born when they're meant to be born, and that seemed to be the right time. So for us now, it's like we would really want funders to come to us and to say, this is what we intend to do, and not to come to us piecemeal. So to come to us as London funders, to come to us as under the ACF, the Associated Charitable Foundation, come to us en masse and have those difficult conversations between yourselves, which I know you're having and will continue to have, but then say, this is our strategy for the way forward. And you know, when you're saying, because when funds come and say we're giving £250,000, £1 million or whatever, it doesn't allow us to see the system operating as a whole. We just end up seeing, you know, dimensions of it. And if you're a small group, even if you're an organisation like us, and we've been around, I mean, it's our 7th official birthday this week, but you know, Ubele came out of conversations for 3 years before that, and before that ran a management consultancy and training company in the social space for 15 years. And I'm really honoured and privileged to have an extraordinary group of people around me and in Ubele who come from years and years of experience in health, education, social care, youth work, right across the sector. So we're not just people who've arrived lately. You know, we've come from a body of knowledge and work. And actually, you know, we are really skilled and experienced. And I sometimes feel a little bit irritated, I'll say, as I'm being diplomatic. Sometimes I've got people, oh, Yvonne Field and Ubele, we've been here. We may be in different spaces, but what we've seen over the last year is that our community are extraordinarily skilled and experienced. We know what we're doing, but we've never been given the opportunity to do it with any longevity, at least. So for me, there's something about the funders coming together and saying, okay, this is what we've done under the London Recovery, Response Fund, and for the pandemic and for the recovery, but actually collective voice around the sector, and let's see what that looks like. And come to the sector, move into dialogue with us. Let's all be around the table and say, this is what we're going to do over the next 5 years. We don't want 1 year, we don't want 6 months, we don't want 3 years, we want 5 years, because that allows us to drill deep, to put the seeds, get the seeds growing, and then to see what we're harvesting. I'm using food metaphors because we've got a lovely growing space, and it's all coming into season right now because it's spring and it's just wonderful there. So for me, there's something about, this is the national strategy, this is a regional strategy, and this is what the pounds on the table look like, and this is what we're contracting with. The last thing I'd say is, the Phoenix Fund that we're involved in designing has come bottom up. It's brought together extraordinary leaders from around the country who will, through their regions, go and find more extraordinary leaders to actually prioritise and target the work that needs to be happened. The lotteries around the table, they're the ones that are hopefully going to be, you know, the initial primary funders. We're in conversation with other funders for the Phoenix Fund. As was mentioned, the Phoenix way, it's a way of working. It's not participatory. I think it's collaborative, which is different in its approach. But actually, you know, we're developing models, and we also have other models. Actually, we've just not actually, they've not actually been brought main stage. And the idea is to do that with the Phoenix way, to actually you know, it doesn't stay a black fund, it doesn't stay a black way. It becomes a main way of doing work in funding.
Yeah. Thanks, Yvonne. They're really, really important. If people were wondering why to get around the table with you, the offer of fresh produce, fresh organic produce is also a welcome offer. But
absolutely,
I think
come and get your lettuce and tomatoes,
really
and callaloo and other things we grow.
See? Why wouldn't we get around the table with you? But I think that point about collective action is really, really powerful as well, because I've been really conscious in some of the work we've done together over the last year that for people who've been less involved in the space over many years, the natural reaction can be, oh, can I speak to Yvonne at Ubele and find out how to deal with, how to be anti-racist in the practice that we have. And what we've seen, and through some of the discussions we've had, is we've seen over many years underinvestment in the infrastructure of Black and minoritized communities, and therefore a need suddenly to speak to people who don't necessarily have the capacity and weren't necessarily set up to be that voice, because there were other ambitions and other visions that they had for what they wanted to do together. And I'm really pleased that the funders in the London Community Response resourced Ubele to do that work alongside them as critical friends, because we've got to do that in a partnership way, and it's got to be done in a way that promotes the collaboration you're talking about and talks about that collective action, that it isn't just constantly sort of drawing and extracting from you, but it is working together. So thank you for the privilege of working with you on that. And that feeds really nicely, Natalie, into a question I was going to ask you to start getting into the Busca papers in a bit more detail, because Yvonne was starting to talk there about some of the ambitions she'd have, or some of the hopes for the future. And obviously we've shared the Busca papers with our network. It's been in the Fund of Five, and members have been in touch to say how pleased they've been to see that report come out and how positive and clear the recommendations are. So hopefully everyone on the call has had the chance to read through it in a bit more detail. But I wonder if you could maybe highlight for us some of the sort of key calls to action that you'd want to focus funders' attention on, so that we can start thinking about how those calls to action can translate into actual action.
Okay, thank you. The first thing I have to sort of add as a disclaimer is that there are 9 call to actions, and this is kind of like how we were able to concise them down into everything that we heard. It's not one person that sat there and like written, this is what we think. It's actually it was a way to harness the collective voice into what I saw as tangible things that people can do. It's very simplified. It's very easy to access. Some of them are, what makes it hard, I think I said this before, what makes it hard is not necessarily the complexity of it, even though it is complex. It's more about the uncomfortable feelings that it brings up. I also want to say, I didn't write it alone. There was Fancy Sanatha and Rana, who also helped me. We also had 2 other researchers. I think it was about 7 women actually who who put this report together, which we noticed at the end when we thought that was really good. I can go through some of the call to actions, but before I do, I just want to see if I can just show you our webpage, because I saw somebody in the chat just sort of say that they couldn't see it. So this is I don't think you can see my mouse, but this is the webpage. And if you go on the webpage, you can see some of the calls to actions that slide along. You can also download the paper here. And then there's also a tab. If you are a Black and minoritized led organization, you can add your signature if you agree what's in it, of course. And here we have a lot of people who've already signed, and this list is just continuously growing. So that is that. Now I'm going to go and show you some of the calls to actions, and I outlined some of the ones that I thought might be key for this discussion. The first one is that, well, Yvonne kind of like already alluded to it, but and yourself, James, but it's about addressing long-term investment. What we saw and what we heard was that there was a big increase in funding last year after the mainstream coverage of Black Lives Matter. And as a result of that, lots of people received money that they hadn't received before. So for some people, it was the first time they'd received funding. And for a lot of people, it was attached to a certain time frame that didn't last longer than a year. Some did, but a lot didn't. And in this, we wanted to kind of like make the point that this can't really be a show or performative for a year in order for it to be successful. It has to be long-term and core investment. Also, what people were saying to me, or us as a team, is that they were often receiving funding project by project basis, and that wasn't enough to sustain their infrastructure, and it wasn't enough to sustain their core costs. And as I mentioned before, a lot of people were doing unpaid labor, and that wasn't accounted for at all. So just to think about in the future, it needs long-term investment, not short-term investment. There's some more details there that you can read in your own time to kind of understand what we mean by it and where we're going with it. But I'm going to move through to some of them that have caused, or people have asked me questions about. So the second one is, in light of the recent report by the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, funders should now recognise that putting Black and minoritized people in positions doesn't automatically equate to being anti-racist. In fact, the strength of institutional racism is such that they may knowingly go against the interest of their community in an effort to sustain their own livelihood as an individual by a system that actively supports and rewards them for doing so. This is kind of more of a reference to diversity and inclusion activities that have taken place. And I think it was you and I, James, when we had a conversation about it, is that actually diversity, equality and inclusion is an industry, and it makes a lot of money. And sometimes it can be seen that, okay, well, I've spent this much money on improving the diversity of my workforce and who's making decisions, therefore I'm reflecting the community. But what we're also realizing and hearing from our communities is that people are being asked to come and speak about anti-racism, or asked to come and represent the communities that they're coming from, without their organizations even being funded in the first place. And this kind of breeds a kind of tokenism that can actually undermine the purpose of that person's organization in the first place. If you want to fund people, you have to fund the people in the communities and listen to what they need, as opposed to kind of parachuting them in to do equality and diversity practices that doesn't necessarily sustain their livelihoods long term, or the health of their organizations that they come from. So I kind of use this as a measurement. If you are spending more on diversity and inclusion than you are actually donating to Black and minoritized people, there's an indicator right there for you to recognize where your money's going and whether whether you really can call it anti-racist practice or not. The other thing I want to say on anti-racism is that it's very easy to say anti-racist. It's very easy to draft a policy and say we are anti-racist. It's very easy to use the language, but it's a lot difficult. It's a lot harder to do it in practice. And it's actually in practice that it has the effect. So making a policy or refining your language to incorporate anti-racist language isn't as effective as donating or giving money and creating long-term investment in the areas that it needs to be and has needed to be. As you mentioned, it's been underfunded for a very long time. So we just wanted to highlight that. Another thing that people ask me is that the boards of funders that they go to, or organizations that they go to, don't always necessarily look like them. And in some cases that they do look like them, they don't necessarily have the same lived experience. And what we're finding is that people with lived experience of the communities that's going to often have a better idea of how to get the money to the right places, or see things that can often be overlooked or not noticed. The key part here as well is, would you be happy to publicly publish the proportion of Black and minoritized organizations you fund, or would you be fearful of that information being released? We also found that there were some people who were willing to say to us the portion of Black minoritized communities that they fund, but were scared of that information being released because they were aware of how it might make them look. And I would just beg the question, if you're having those feelings about it, then therein lies a bit of something you should probably look at. I'm going to skip through some of them because they can take up a lot of time, but they are all available on the website for you to see. And I'm going to go to 5, because I actually think this discussion is hopefully going to be a demonstration of how we can relate to each other. Exclusion takes many forms and a harmful experience for Black and minoritized people to go through in social and professional networks that eventually erodes their health, well-being, and life expectancy. Funders build their own networks and relationships with need to build more networks and relationships with people in the sector to build and nurture trusting relationships that foster a much more open dialogue. What we were getting a lot of feedback about was there was a lot of transactional relationships as opposed to relational. What we mean by that is it's more like, we would like you to come in and we will fund you this amount of money. Then the exchange is, or the conditions are, we can then ask you about XYZ, you can then appear and talk about XYZ. It's not necessarily listening to the people behind what's happening. It's not necessarily talking about the issues that have become obstacles, like we did at the start of this discussion. You were quite open to talk about whiteness, and that is kind of like something that we need to all be able to do and hold. It isn't just on the onus of Black and minoritized communities to consistently talk and consistently reiterate the things that need to happen and the changes that they need to see. As Yvonne said earlier, it's done, it's been happening. There is enough evidence out there, there is enough education out there. We don't need to continuously keep saying the same thing over and over again for it to be got. There is a conversation that needs to happen on the other side, as you framed it, Joe, where actually, are you able to have these open dialogues with your staff, with your team, and with people that relate to Black and minoritized communities in their day jobs? Is this something that they're aware of when they sit at the table? The power dynamics at play. Taking steps to reach out, nurture and foster authentic relationships with Black and minoritized people in the community takes into account power dynamics. The other thing that we've had fed back to us is that sometimes people don't know, and I have to be blunt, they just don't know any Black or minoritized people. They're not people that they're in their everyday lives. So they sometimes just reach for the one person that they know, but what they don't see or realize is that one person is getting 300 requests a day to talk. And we see it really evidently that there's a rush to reach for people that you know. I think the wider question is, if you only know 1 or 2 people, then there is something there that for you to look at. And how do you reach out to people, not invite them to come to you? How do you go? Yvonne made a reference to Wolves Lane. Wolves Lane is the most beautiful community centre I've ever seen. There are so many people doing things up and down the country that you can go and visit, that you can go and take the initiative to go and speak to and learn about. It doesn't have to be, here's an open call and everybody come to us. It doesn't have to be like that. And I think there's lots of examples where it isn't like that are really useful. Yes, the other part in here was share your networks and your contacts with community groups. When we're thinking about privilege, we also have to understand that not everybody has access to networks. So the things that the opportunities that might come in your inbox that you hear about might not be knowledge for people who have different networks. And if you want to share, that is also a really useful thing. Sharing your resources, sharing your knowledge, sharing your intel about opportunities that are available that people might not have come across otherwise. And if you know other funders, if you are like, well, we can't fund you, but we know someone who can. If you have that intel, it's really useful to share that information and share that as public knowledge for all of us to learn from together. The other thing is, the one I wanted to raise was this, because I actually got pushback from funders because they simply didn't believe me. And I just want to make it clear again. We hear of rejections more than we do of successes in achieving funding for our community. This has a devastating effect on confidence for community groups to go back and reapply. Publishing data about the application process is just one aspect. We need to understand who is being turned down and for what reasons for funders to demonstrate accountability. And I am actually going to go into the call to actions for this one, because I think they can be confronting, but I think they're necessary for us to look at and understand. So the number of applications received with clear information on how many applicants came from Black and minoritized communities. These are things that we suggest is good to publish. The number of applications that pass the assessment stage with clear information of how many applications came from Black and minoritized communities. The number of applications that received a positive outcome with clear information on how many applications came from Black and minoritized communities. In relation to those successful outcomes, clear information on the amounts requested and awarded. We understand that this isn't always possible, but if we were to look at what would be best practice, this is what it might look like. Most importantly, the number of applications that were not successful at each stage with clear information on how many applicants came from Black and minoritized community organizations and the reasons why they were refused. And this relates to the next slide that I'm not going to go into in too much detail, but there was an overwhelming feedback that people were being told that the reason that they didn't get the funding is because they're just not good enough. No further explanation than that. We know that that isn't true. And we also know that some of the communities that have applied for funding and didn't get it went through extensive and exhaustive cross-checking with experts to ensure that their applications were good enough. So we know that that isn't the only reason why people are getting rejected. And even though people are getting to the application stage and maybe are getting to the interviews, when those doors close and the decision-making process happens, somewhere in that decision-making process, it isn't reflected in the outcomes. So the outcomes are what we are concerned with, not necessarily just the application stage. And I know I'm going on a little bit, so I'm just going to whiz through to the last one, because James, you asked me what is getting the most traction from funders. At the moment, we don't necessarily hear what's happening as a result of these call to action. We hope that they are having an impact. One that we did notice was Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust did actually publish the relationship between the funds that they have and the history of slavery. And we saw that as a positive step. And we saw that as part of this one, which is number 9, prove your legitimacy by publishing and demonstrating how you're taking accountability for where your money comes from. That isn't what we mean behind this, or what the thing we're trying to convey behind this is. It isn't just about, is your money clean in the sense that it's taken from XYZ companies only, or the money comes from, you know, UN approved bodies. What it also means is what is the relationship to the history of the UK British Empire with that money. People didn't wake up and just have trust funds, like they came from somewhere, and people didn't just wake up and not have trust funds. There are well, they did, but there are reasons why this money is unequally distributed between the people that have it and the people that don't. And if we look at the reasons why that money is unequally distributed, a lot of it is rooted in history. A lot of it, certainly in the UK, is related to the British history of empire, and a lot of people don't know that history. A lot of people aren't familiar with that history. A lot of people aren't necessarily willing to go and find out. So that was kind of where this one came to. I'm struggling to work out how to stop sharing now. So just, oh, there we go. So that was just a bit on that. I'm aware that you need to ask questions, but before you do, there was a couple of things that I just wanted to highlight since the Busca papers and in the duration of it. A report was published, and I nodded to it slightly in the call to actions about the report that came from government that essentially said that institutional racism doesn't exist. There are two things to say about that report. One, it had an detrimental impact to people's mental health, particularly in line of gaslighting that I mentioned earlier. The other thing is it proves the point that someone else said in this report that I highlighted. The argument that racism exists and that is bad and shouldn't happen hasn't actually been won, certainly not in the UK government. And if that is the case, then there is still way more work to do, particularly in communities who are white, to talk about it and to reference the fact that it is real. It is real. It's an exhaustive process to go through to try and reiterate the same facts over and over again, when last summer everybody seemed to know quite quickly what they were. We are seeing a spike in hate crimes. We are seeing an increase in funding to the police. And we are seeing these things happen simultaneously as the funding to Black and minoritized communities doesn't look so certain. So if you add those things together and you imagine the experience of being in the middle of that, that's something that we need to put into perspective. I'm not saying that you'll be able to imagine it, but I'm saying that put it into perspective, that this is a compounding situation. It's not just isolated to one sector, it's happening to everybody everywhere. But in terms of the third sector, these are the people that have the knowledge, the resources, the access, and the information. As Yvonne said, there has been years of reports that have been done. Now would be a good time to have a look. Yes, and I'm aware of time, so I'm being quiet now. The end.
Never be quiet, Natalie. It's always a privilege to work with you on these things, and thank you for sharing that so clearly and also optimistically, I think, in terms of having that sense that we have a calls to action here, and we have clarity about what needs to happen, and we need to start moving towards action rather than just always talking about it. So thank you for that. We have got time to take a few of the questions that have come up in the Q&A box, and one of them that's been upvoted does sort of link to what you were just saying there about the challenges in the UK context. And the question is about if there's any learning internationally that we should know about, conscious that both of you have got links and networks with other countries, other organisations, other networks. Is the UK behind in the conversation about funding and race? Are there things that we can learn from other people? Yvonne, do you mind if I come to you first on that one?
Yeah, I'm going to say this sort of gingerly, because I do get really quite annoyed when we kind of look to the USA for examples of best practice, particularly for Black communities, because as I've been saying, you know, I've been involved in this work for over 40 years, and we actually have developed a lot of work that actually, partly because of how systemic racism works, means did not get then scaled up into best practice. You know, so I'm aware that in terms of funding, that actually there's a lot of practice in the UK, in the USA. We actually hosted a conversation in March with the Black Farmers Fund, because we wanted to learn how they were investing in the development of Black farms in New York State. And, you know, it was a really interesting learning opportunity. Also, I spent a lot of time in South Africa since the early 2000s. And there's been a lot of work, some interesting work, particularly around racial justice work, given the history of apartheid, with foundations and philanthropists in South Africa. So I think it'd be worth looking there, for example, for other really, you know, interesting areas that we can learn from. And I'm assuming the same story would be the case in places like India, Brazil, you know, other, you know, large global South countries that actually have done extraordinary work, particularly to reach micro groups. And I just want to pick up on the question that's come up about definition of user led by, yeah. You know, obviously, James, we've been involved in the work with other equity partners, and there's been a shift now. I mean, I think a really important shift in terms of certainly percentage-wise, what we're looking at. So 75% in terms of the trustee group, and, you know, over 50% in terms of senior staff being the definition. However, the point that Kelly Rust makes about smaller groups, it's not so much about, I mean, we're still quite happy to support that definition. I think there is another conversation that needs to happen about what constitutes a small group, because we've been supporting over 100 groups since October last year, 122 groups with capacity building through funding from the Lottery and Charities Aid Foundation. And actually, the average turnover of those 22 groups nationally was £30,000. Now, they fall outside the micro, but they're too, for us, they don't quite fit into the small category, which is between 10 and 100,000. That masks the reality of, you know, the myriad of majority of groups in our sector. We also saw that sort of, it was really up to 40, 50,000 pounds majority Black and minority ethnic organisations in the work that we did around funding for the with Power to Change and the Clause programme. Again, so I think that small category needs to have a secondary or another category within it. It's just too big for the majority of our sector.
Fantastic. Thanks, Yvonne. I'm going to ask a question, Natalie, I'll probably come to you first on this one, which is on the accountability side. You mentioned at the end there, you know, not always being clear about whether funders had taken action and what was happening as a result. You know, you've noted some positive qualities. What sort of accountability mechanisms would you like to see in the funding community to make sure that momentum is kept up and that people don't carry on as they were before this?
I think time measured action plans. I think the thing that strikes me about the sector as a whole is there are enough people with enough skills to execute an action plan that seems impossible. If we think about the charity sector, a lot of work that people do is around a mission or a value, and then creating an organization or a fund or an action plan to do something about it. So I fail to believe that we don't have the skills or the experience for people to do something. But with the call to action, we all created them in a way that was so clear and simple that they should be used as a tool for you to go away and make an action plan. And with the action plan comes time measurements. I think it was when we did the Funding So Why, I think I said it there, where there's a lot of people who say we're on a journey, and I've heard the word journey more times than I've ever heard it in my life in the last year, which is great. Like it is a journey, but that journey is not a choice for Black and minoritized people, and I think that's the key difference. It's not a journey for Black and minoritized community that they have any choice over. So does that journey include time measured outcomes? Does it include accountability mechanisms? And are you holding yourselves to account? Because we can't do that. And we're happy to look, as Yvonne said, we're happy to say, okay, what are you going to do about it? But actually, even working with Yvonne, I've noticed how much Yvonne has to do in a day to run her own organization, to actually then be the person that everybody's kind of putting things under her nose to say, can you check this? Are we doing this? It's a lot. And it's also undermining the point that it is your responsibility. And I think unlocking conversations about whiteness itself and getting more comfortable with that is going to hopefully encourage people to realize that the responsibility of accountability is on the groups that have the power. And in that sense, I think that the calls to actions are a great starting point for you to then create measured outcomes. And if you can't get there or you aren't there yet, how are you going to get there? And that will have an impact. If everybody did that, that would have an impact. It wouldn't solve the whole situation, but it would certainly have an impact for groups and the funding that they receive.
Can I also just quickly add to that? Yeah, just that I think there's a need also for a bit of organisation of the system. I mentioned it earlier, but I think there's a need for those funds that have emerged over the last 15 months that have actually been led by Black and brown people to come together as funds like Resourcing Racial Justice, Phoenix Fund, those that have been advocating charities, so White Future Foundations, Baobab, that's coming up. I think there's a need for those and others where there's been clear leadership from us within the sector to come together. And I think there needs to be a space created both for us and with us by the white-led charitable sector as well, foundations, so that we can, as Natalie said, we can actually have a system on a 4-on-4 accountability, that actually, you know, that the strategies are developed that I mentioned earlier, that this the sort of time, there's a time boundary around that. It's really clear what the measures are, what the outcomes are supposed to be. And that group can work jointly together to actually set up this system of accountability. People shouldn't be scared of us. We're quite nice people, generally speaking. And we think you're quite nice people, generally speaking, trying to do the best that you can. So I think there's a space now that this year is really busted open, that we can actually step in together and actually do this work.
Fantastic. Thanks, Yvonne. I will echo that you are all nice people, but you're also what the best friends should be, which is critical where you need to be, honest where you need to be, and clear about how you want that friendship to develop, so that it's a powerful one that can achieve what everyone wants. So it's a bit beyond a privilege over the last year to be able to work with you both and your team. It's been fantastic to have you with us to share your learning from the last year and beyond, and also the calls to action that have been really clear. I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to start moving on from talking about those calls to action to actually some action now. And that's really at the heart of the festival, to try and bring some of that learning, some of that ambition together, so that we can look at what the collective action we need to take is beyond this. So thank you everybody for joining us. If you had colleagues that were not able to be part of the conversation today, please know we have recorded the session, and we will be putting it on the London Funders YouTube channel, because we're very trendy like that, soon. So you will be able to share it with your colleagues, and there'll also be a report coming out that summarises all the learning from these discussions. And there's some other sessions you'll see coming up in the festival with Baobab Foundation and others that we're also keen, as Yvonne says, to look at some of that learning in the rounds and how we can take action together. So we look forward to seeing it in one of those future sessions. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you particularly to Yvonne and Natalie for your powerful and helpful contributions to the discussion. We look forward to working with you for the future. But for now, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the festival.
Thanks everyone. Thank you for inviting us. Bye.